Hello, thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to this, the start of our 5th year of these events, which are brought to you by the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button and not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try to put most of them to the panel for consideration. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you, so that there isn't a bottleneck at the end or that we don't run out of time. So thanks for joining us, and over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike. Good to see you again and launch a 5th season of this is our 49th monthly program, to be precise. We have a particularly rich cast and a broad range of experiences to draw upon, and an extremely important and timely topic. I will introduce people briefly. John Battle served as a Labour Party Member of Parliament in the UK for 13 years and was a cabinet minister in the government of Prime Minister Tony Blair, whom I think we all remember. Ambassador Barbara Bodine spent more than 30 years in the US Foreign Service, focusing particularly on the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf, and was at one point, I believe, ambassador to Yemen, as a matter of fact. E.J. Dionne writes about politics in a weekly column for the Washington Post. He is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and teaches here at Georgetown University in the School of Public Affairs. Susan Eisenhower, a policy analyst with a focus on national security and a veteran of many of these discussions and others as well, much sought after for her wisdom and balance, and a specialist in energy issues, among other things. Ellen Closs-Stevens is the electoral commissioner for Wales in the UK, and she's an emeritus professor of communications and creative industries at Aberystwyth University. That doesn't roll easily off an American
That's
tongue.
very good.
And thanks for joining us also, Ellen. I want to start out with a very broad topic that I think many will find timely. Donald Trump continues to name members of his new administration and continues to ask that they not be subjected to the usual long delay or examination before they take office when he becomes president in January. And so I think it's fair to say that among some people, the panic grows about what's going to happen. So my question to each of you, and I'm looking for fairly brief answers, is it legitimate now to panic 8 days after the election? Or is the hysteria, if one can call it that, a little bit overdone? Are things likely to settle down a bit and be a little more reasonable? Susan, I'd like to ask you first to address that question.
Well, I'm going to have to go back to the notion of independence here. Independent voter. I have been for since the Obama race. I just want to say, I personally think that this is a time for look and see. Panic hysteria doesn't do anything when you don't control matter. It is a version of energy that might be put towards trying to find a new plan for the Democratic Party, one that is more from a programmatic standpoint, because the election underscores the fact that some of their base wandered and probably played unexpected broad victory. So I think panic and hysteria might be, maybe quote Robert Frost here, the strong are staying silent until they see. I like that idea.
Thank you, Susan. EJ, what is your view on this? You're required to pronounce on these matters at least once a week. And so what's your latest thinking that you're delivering to your many readers?
Well, first, I want to say I feel very blessed to be connected, at least for a moment, with Blackfriars and Campion Hall, and I will try to be appropriately reflective here. Someone once said in criticism of a particular politician that he knows only two speeds, complacency and panic. And I think complacency and panic are both mistakes in politics. But I do think there is a lot to worry about from what we have seen in the early days of Trump. Concern, alarm, there are a lot of other words that you might use. That Trump looks like he intends to govern as he told us he would govern. And I do think it's particularly concerning that barely a week out, and he is telling the Senate to dispense with the usual constitutional order and to say, I want you to go into recess so I can name these people to the cabinet. And what's distressing about that is not just that it's a violation of the constitutional order. And it's not just that the Senate won't get to vote on these nominees, is that he could be also trying to evade hearings on some of these nominations. And his defense secretary in particular, there are so many Republican senators said, huh, who is he? He is, God bless him, he's got 2 Bronze Stars. I respect that. But he has no experience running any large organization. And that nomination, as I say, came as a shock to Republicans, a lot of Republicans as well as Democrats. And I think the other cause for worry is that he seems to be ramping up very quickly his plan to deport a large number of people who are in the United States without proper papers. That could be a hugely divisive, dangerous, really troublesome action. And you already have the governor of Massachusetts saying, we won't cooperate with these mass roundups. So I think there is a whole lot to worry about. I agree with Susan that this has to be married to inward look by Democrats. Now, I'll just say one other thing, which is my theory of this campaign is that it was a run-of-the-mill election that had explosive results. A run-of-the-mill election in that it was really a normal expression of anger over high prices, economic stress, and for many voters, immigration. When you look at where President Biden's approval rating was, his disapproval rating with this electorate was, according to the exit polls, it was around 58 or 59%. An incumbent party doesn't usually get reelected with that number. The classic is the country on the right track or moving in the wrong direction, wrong track. The wrong track number was 3-1 or more ahead of the moving in the right direction. So Harris faced a huge climb. She came relatively close. It was not a landslide. I think it's very important to underscore that, but it was a fairly comprehensive victory. And Democrats do have a lot of thinking to do, but I also think we shouldn't overread the result as some kind of broad mandate. It's not a broad mandate, but it's a significant result for Trump and the Republicans.
Robert Bodine, I want to go to you next as a kind of transition to our international participants in this discussion as well. You have been involved in foreign policy matters for your entire adult life. And so I think I want you to answer it still concisely, but on a double track. How does this, is the panic, or maybe we dispense with the word panic, is the deep concern on the part of some people justified both at home and abroad, or is it going to ease up in both domains?
Okay, I'm glad we've gotten away from the word panic, but I think deep concern is a valid reaction, in part because we have seen the Trump movie before. And sequels are generally not as good as the originals. He has signaled, as EJ very nicely laid out, he's moving very quickly on deportations with Homan and Steve Miller. Some of his foreign policy choices have been puzzling in terms of what they bring in terms of expertise to both topic and management. He has made it very clear that he does not believe in alliances. He is more comfortable with autocrats. He has a very strong America first approach, which unfortunately tends to become America only. And he's bringing in people, and I will put an asterisk on this, Rubio is still to be determined, that support his broad worldview. I think internationally, at the risk of lumping 190 some odd countries together, I think overall our allies are concerned. I think our adversaries are probably befuddled because one of the hallmarks of Trump, and I don't see any reason that this is going to change, is that he is very erratic. He will have one position and hours later go 180 degrees, depending on all sorts of factors, few of which are facts and analysis. And so I think the erratic chaos element of Trump's foreign policy is what has both allies and adversaries cautious and concerned. We don't know what we're getting, but what we saw as the prelude was not reassuring.
Mm-hmm.
You're muted, Sandy.
Thank you. I was muting to try to stop things from switching around so much. John Battle, as a former cabinet minister in a Labour Party government in Britain, how do you see this? And are you as worried as many Americans are?
I'd certainly, I think what EJ said about complacency and panic. I've been in politics locally in Leeds for 10 years and then in Parliament for 23 years during the Mrs. Thatcher years, and the times when Labour cozied up, if you like, to the Clinton regime, and then George Bush came in. So our questions then were, how do we back the wrong side and would we get any entry? So I think our view here is that don't panic, but deal with the people that you've got. But at the same time, know that politics nationally and internationally at the present time is incredibly volatile. So what look as swings, say, in the last government when we had the election and Labour won, was it really such a clear sweep, or are there real basic issues? And one of the things that I would say from this election is I think that we have to address, whether it's in Britain or elsewhere in the international community, the loss of agreement on some of the fundamentals. And I think there is quite a systemic disagreement that highlights itself in the crisis between democracy and modern capitalism, if you like, a monopoly capitalism, the big entrepreneurs and the money driving the system. I think I remember in the days of Mrs. Thatcher, she used to quote, was it a great guru was Friedman, and he always used to say that democratic societies would destroy a free economy because it would lead to mass demonstrations for the radical redistribution of wealth, something that my life's been part of resisting that equation. But I think there are some real questions to ask in Britain. The big issues on the table are, of course, NATO, security, and tariffs, and what that would do to our economy. But deeper than that are questions in Britain saying, what about polarization and the deepening of polarization? What about, and I think the phrase you use in America, politicians crossing the aisle, for example, what about the demonization of government, local authority and public institutions? Can we have a decent conversation now about where we go with that agenda?
Ellen, from your perspective, what are the worries and the concerns?
Well, thank you. What surprised me was how very unsurprised I was by his victory. And it's as if I sort of knew at the back of my mind that somehow he had great strength in this election and that he was a very big contender. And so I didn't sort of wake up or stay up all night and become totally surprised. But I was surprised by the visibility, and this chimes in with what John has just said, the visibility of the big tech and the Bitcoin people and so on within this election. I mean, we all understand that behind the scenes there's a lot of money pouring in, and you know, for a variety of reasons to every election. But in this one, the visibility of Elon Musk through his purchase of Twitter, which then became X, and you could look at that in two ways. I mean, the visibility is almost brash or disconcerting, or you could say he's more transparent than some of the other moguls that have sort of handed money to campaigns in the past. But it does lead you to the I can't remember exactly who said this, but about the United Kingdom, that we treat Trump's words with the utter seriousness, regard the man himself less seriously, and that the right approach was to disregard a lot of the rhetoric, but to treat the direction of travel with the utmost seriousness. So if you are looking towards deregulation of big tech and deregulation of business in general, then I think you have to look at this election as being quite significant.
Thank you. I have to ask that anyone, when you're not speaking, that everyone please be on mute. We're having a phenomenon where somebody's background noise or sound is causing the picture to change a great deal. So if you could please be on mute, and then I'll remind you to unmute, a reminder I can use myself when you do begin to talk again. Susan, I'd like to go back to you to ask how, and you have said you're an independent voter, and I know you are, and I respect that. So how do you personally think that a responsible citizen should proceed now in dealing with the outcome of this election? When a Fox News weekend anchor appears to be on the verge of being named the Secretary of Defense, which is not just some sort of weekend assignment such as he's used to now, that I have to say is if he were being named perhaps Secretary of something else, I would postpone my concern at least. But what do we do in these circumstances?
Well, Sandy, first of all, let me say there's a difference between concern and being panicked or hysterical. So let me just make a comment about being an independent voter first. I think many people outside the United States don't realize what a massive voting bloc that is. Now, I use the word bloc incorrectly because this independent voters are not organized. They have just declined to be a member of either the Republicans or the Democrats. So that tells you something about a systemic problem we have in this country that should be addressed at some point, perhaps, or we will continue to have surprises like this, I guess. By the way, I wasn't surprised either by the outcome. Let me just say that this appointee for Secretary of Defense is curious, sounds too passive, but I don't even understand this appointment in light of the fact that Donald Trump was the one who continually reminded us that we were on the verge of World War III. And I do think that that was a weakness of the Democrats' campaign, is that they did not speak to the anxiety that Americans feel when they pick up the paper in the morning and read about these two wars that are going on, and have enough of an imagination to predict or be concerned about an escalation. So it's a very curious, I think, appointment that requires some concern. And this is where I think, without getting panicked, people can stand up and insist on things. I'd like to just flag for other comments Jerome Powell's extraordinarily brave resistance to pressure coming from the president-elect or his allies. No, he's not going to step down under any pressure as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. So maybe those in Congress should just say that the American people are going to hold them accountable for their Secretary of Defense, and they better have hearings and they better do it a proper way.
EJ, do you see any members of Congress, and particularly Republicans, who might behave as Susan suggests would be appropriate at this time?
Well, I think one of the things that's happened since Donald Trump came down that escalator in 2015 is that the Republican Party has largely capitulated to him. And there are a few, I can imagine, senators like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins continuing to have some real independence from him. In fact, Senator Murkowski was elected without the Republican label, even though she's a Republican. When she got beaten in a primary, she won a write-in campaign, so she has a lot of independence. But if the Republican majority in the Senate, holds up to be 53, which seems likely, it's not clear who else you can point to in the Senate. We're going to get an interesting indicator today about how independent Republicans might try to be with the election of a leader in a Republican leader. That Senators Thune and Cornyn are kind of still old-fashioned sorts of Republicans. Senator Scott, who's trying to beat them, has gotten support from almost all the people in Trump world. The advantage Republican senators have is this is a secret ballot. And so we won't know exactly who voted against Senator Scott. And Trump himself has not weighed in yet, at least last I checked my phone, because he understands that Scott isn't very popular there. But I think if they elect someone other than Scott, it shows some independence. The problem is that these two contenders quickly fell into line when Trump said, I want to speed up my appointments. So I think the worst, I think panic is better than, neither panic nor complacency is better. But if I had to pick of the two, of a bad choice, I'd pick panic. But I'd rather have concern or alarm or watchfulness. There's one thing that gives me some hope, which is that Donald Trump is a lame duck president. The 22nd Amendment is as clear as day that it doesn't say no one can serve 2 consecutive terms. It says you can only be elected twice to the presidency. My hope is that the fact that Trump can't run for re-election might begin to give some Republicans a little bit of room in their own heads that I have to start worrying about the world after Trump, not the world under Trump. Now, that could take a while in coming. A lot of damage could be done in the meantime. But I think it's very important for people to recognize this lame duck quality of this presidency that could lead him to be quite extreme and get a lot of things done. He will no doubt say there's some way of reading the 22nd Amendment that will allow him to run again. I don't think even Justice Alito or Justice Thomas could read the amendment saying anything but. He's limited here. So I think we need to play at that sort of flexibility in the joints, if you will, and hope that some people become a little more willing to stand up. But I've got to say, in the short run, I'm not terribly optimistic.
Barbara Bodine, I saw you shaking your head negatively for a moment there. You're not too optimistic, I take it.
No,
No.
I'm not optimistic.
No.
I just
Yeah.
I'm holding out a bit of hope on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was shaking my head more in agreement, if that makes any sense whatsoever. I think one of my concerns with the Senate is a concern writ large with what we're going into, is that despite words already said that this election should not be taken as a landslide or a mandate or anything else, Trump is taking it as a landslide and a mandate. And he's acting as if he has a mandate. And this, forget your advise and consent constitutional thing, is kind of one of the first elements. Another concern is that when Trump was in the first time, you still had a number of Republicans, and the one who comes most quickly to mind is Jeff Flake, but a number of Republicans who were willing to stand up for themselves, for their institution, for broader values. The Senate now, it's not just that it's 53, but it's 53 people, Republicans, who see themselves to a very large extent as having come in on the Trump wave. Some of them are congressmen who have moved up. So we don't have the same kind of Republican senators this time as we had the last time. And I think that's critically important. The other element, and it's a little bit broader, but it goes to this, forget your advise and consent duty, is there aren't going to be the guardrails that we had last time. However, insufficient and battered and routinely fired they were. Trump has said that he intends to weaponize the Department of Justice. I don't know anything about this person who's been nominated for Secretary of Defense, but he does not sound like somebody who is going to tell the president, no, you cannot use American forces against American protesters. So I think what he's doing with this gentleman is, I was going to say disestablishing guardrails, but yeah, getting rid of the guardrails to actions that he has said he intends to take. So you're not going to have a strong Secretary of Defense. I don't know what's going to happen to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We're not going to have a attorney general. All of those kinds of guardrails. The woman who's been appointed chief of staff sounds like a very nice person, but she is not going to come in with the policy creds and the sense of her own power that somebody like a John Kelly brought in. And so, this, he famously said that he was only going to be a dictator for a day. Well, I think you can do an awful lot of damage in the 873 executive actions you sign on the first day and then spend 4 years implementing them. So the lack of guardrails in the Senate, in Congress, in these senior administration positions, I think is what makes me deeply concerned and on occasion panicked.
Could I just take a quick second to underscore something Barbara said, which is, it is very concerning that this administration, from everything we already know, will be very different than the first. In the first administration, he brought in a lot of people who were traditional government people, you know, in the Secretary of State's job and a whole lot of other jobs. And they really did act as a check. There's a famous story of Gary Cohn, his economic advisor, seeing a piece of paper on the desk that proposed abrogating a trade treaty with South Korea. And he took it off Trump's desk before Trump could see it, because he was trying to prevent Trump from doing this. You won't have people pulling the papers off his desk. You won't have people in the administration checking him in the same way, because he has said it himself. He's determined to fill his administration with people who will support exactly what he wants to do. That is a real worry. Looking at this, most of this initial list, there are a couple of slightly traditionalist people on it, but not very many.
Could I just quickly insert something here, because this is exactly on topic? I think, you know, the Democrats have to be very, very careful about this, because if they start out making Trump the issue again, all those people who cross the line are not going to be very happy. They have got what has to be explained sometimes to foreign audiences, is that people have to realize we have midterm elections in this country. And we've got 2 years for the whole conversation to be reframed. But if they're going to start with this Trump is the enemy of people as a narrative, it's going to go back to the same thing, as that his supporters are going to defend him. There's got to be a lot of very deep thinking about this, because this is the chance for America to send a strong signal.
Yeah.
That's 2 years from now. And, you know, we all know in Washington that the midterm elections have probably just started.
Yeah. Can I just do one little quick
Sorry.
Go ahead, Ellen, go ahead.
Ellen, please.
Just come back on what Stans had just said. I think this is broader than simply the election of Trump. It's actually an international narrative about the way in which our democracies are fragmenting and being threatened from within. You know, I mean, is a democracy that is 48-52 or 49-51 of two opposing sides that absolutely just shout at each other within their own echo chamber, you know, is that a functioning democracy, or is it just two factions that will never agree on anything? And I come back to my worry that there are certain instruments within our discourse, including the regulation of social media, including the regulation of our television and so on, where there is an ability to verify or to have some sort of discussion, which, to use your phrase again, is an independent voice. And if I'm following you correctly, I think that you're saying that the Democrats should be very careful that they preserve that independence of voice, or that kind of center ground. Otherwise, this will just escalate an international sweep of Western democracies that are really threatened by complete divisiveness. And I don't know where we go from that if we don't have some sort of central platform where we can discuss things reasonably amicably.
I'd like to ask John Battle, who I think, I'm sorry, thank you, Ellen. I'd like to ask John Battle to comment on this, because he has been involved at the highest level in politics in the UK, and I wonder, John, what do you think? Fear, perhaps, but what do you think is likely to be the impact on European democracies?
Let me say I completely agree with Alan. When I went into politics as a young man some years ago, a Conservative politician, Quentin Hogg-Lord Hailsham, said, "Beware of elective dictatorship." And my question would be about the checks and balances. I think we're using the word guardrails now, and it's been absolutely illuminating to hear this conversation, because I hope the guardrails are not just internal to the Senate and the House of Representatives, just as the guardrails ought not to be just in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. In other words, where are the debates about checks and balances in the judiciary and in the media? And I'll give a practical example. In our country, we had a great crisis around Brexit, and it wasn't about partisan breaking the rules about lockdown. It was around Prime Minister Johnson suspending Parliament with what was called proroguing to block a vote, where that was seen as unconstitutional, if you like, even though we've not got a written constitution, but defying the checks and balances. Similarly, some politicians on the right and on the left think that withdrawing from the European Commission on Human Rights is another removal of checks and balances. And I think we need a good debate in Western democracies about what the parameters are of these guardrails and checks and balances. And the question I'd ask our American colleagues is, are there going to be checks and balances? And the great point was made about midterm elections. I think that's really important. That's true in our society as well, with local government elections, regional elections. You've always got those breaks in for an electoral process. But what about those independent checks and balances, and how strong can they be in a sense, screwing up the directives from the administration and holding them back?
Can I say something? Susan mentioned the challenge to Democrats, and I think they face a very difficult set of choices, because I think they need to do two things simultaneously, and they will fly into each other sometimes. She's absolutely right. They need to answer some of the discontent in the electorate that is still there after Joe Biden, even though paradoxically Joe Biden did quite a lot of good things for working class blue collar people, but this did not penetrate down all the way down. My hometown is a place called Fall River, Massachusetts. Think Huddersfield, Crosby, Redcar, some of those red wall seats. It's an old factory town, very strongly union back in the day when we had union jobs, that's been hammered by the economy. Fall River, for the first time in 100 years, voted Republican for president. The last time we voted Republican for president in Fall River was for Calvin Coolidge. The Democrats would typically get 70-75% of the vote there. That speaks to, that's a sort of extreme case of what has happened to the working class base of the Democratic Party, which, by the way, has happened to Labor and Social Democratic parties in many parts of Europe. And they've got to work on that. At the same time, the challenges that Trump puts forward are so great, and the available checks and balances are very limited, because you will, it looks like, have a unified Republican Congress. The Supreme Court, after its decision granting Trump it's a very incoherent decision. I think it's going to have to be relitigated, but granting him the kind of immunity that will make him feel he can do anything and pardons can do the rest is really very disconcerting. And so Democrats are stuck. They're going to have to do two things at the same time, whether they sometimes collide with each other or not.
Barbara.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on this whole issue of guardrails. It's far more than just what Congress can or cannot do. They're almost sometimes the last stop. And I want to reiterate my point that the cabinet is going to be a major issue because he's going to staff it with people who, like the potential Secretary of Defense, will not be a guardrail. There's another guardrail that I'm particularly concerned about. I did spend my life in the federal government, and that is Trump's Schedule F, which would basically turn our professional civil service, foreign service, FBI agents, and to a certain extent, listening to Trump, military officers, all into political appointees. Where you either go along or you get out. And, I'm, as a career servant, we do not try to sabotage what the president wants to do, but our job has always been to speak truth, to say, if you pull this FTA with South Korea, it's going to do this. And if people are either fired or silenced or afraid, you're not going to have a fact-based, analysis-based consideration of policy. Decisions are his. But that's a 2 million person guardrail that could go away.
And if I might,
yeah.
if I might add to what you say, it lies behind all of the other decisions. The mass deportations, should they come about, every other area being considered, the attitude, which we haven't mentioned yet, and I really meant for us to make sure we talk about, but the attitudes toward freedom of the press, free speech, free expression in its other forms. In a funny way, despite all the disputes that come up, it's the career civil service that protects freedom of speech and some of our other free expressive habits in this country. So and that one is dependent on the courts to protect it. And I know that at the moment, President Biden is trying to get Congress to confirm as many judicial appointments as possible in this lame duck session of Congress. But there will still be many, many judgeships for President Trump to fill. And by the way, EJ, I'd like your thoughts on this. He was the most successful of recent presidents during his first term at filling judicial vacancies, if I'm not mistaken. Trump was.
Yeah.
You're on mute, EJ.
Biden got quite a lot of judges through in his term, but of course, except for Ketanji Brown Jackson, he didn't have the power to name all those Supreme Court justices, and some of them are getting older, and Trump could have more opportunities. And with the majority they have in the Senate, the filibuster does not apply on judicial appointments. And you could get appointees through with 50 votes, even if Murkowski and Susan Collins dissented, and one other, 50 votes because J.D. Vance would break the tie.
As vice president.
No, it's true. And by the way, Judge Aileen Cannon, the person who threw out the strongest case against Trump on those classified documents, that was probably the most slam dunk case. She was confirmed after Biden won the election in this period waiting for the other inauguration. So it's just an interesting fact. But yeah, the fights over the judiciary are going to be real, but there is no real power at the moment to block very many of the judges that Trump names. And you wonder how many of them will be kind of normal, more conservative, but play by the rules judges, and how many will be even outside that frame.
Well, I've even heard speculation that Trump might encourage Justices Thomas and Alito to retire now so that he can name much younger conservatives to keep the Supreme Court conservative longer, no matter what happens in electoral politics coming up.
Sandy, if I may, I'd like to go back to the guardrails thing again. And I know I'm sounding repetitive, but I want to actually ramp this up a bit. One of the biggest guardrails is a strong two-party system, and that means the Democrats, as far as I'm concerned, need to get their act together. The reason Vice President Harris, I think one of the big reasons, and I say this as an independent talking to other independents, failed is what are we having a campaign around joy? There wasn't a joyful person in the United States of America during this election. And then the night Oprah comes out with her, my heart sank all the way down to my toes, because I understood that it tone deaf. And, you know, if there were a strong leader for the Democratic Party right now, and so I think that's one of their big challenges, EJ, is for them to find somebody to replace her who can begin to craft a message that is strong and powerful to retake back, you know, those constituencies that left. Now, I know the other things are worrisome. They're dangerous if they happen and the rest of it. But what would be more dangerous is if Trump enlarges his mandate through Congress 2 years from now. And nobody has said it on this call, but I have to say I respect Kamala Harris, but I don't know who was telling her to talk about joy, but that one fell absolutely flat.
I think you're right. We're going to switch over to Mike Scott in just a moment. So people who have questions that they've not yet put into the Q&A button would want to do that right away. There are several waiting for them. But before we go to Mike, I want to ask a blunt question and get blunt, quick answers from everybody. And this is a subject in which everyone's an expert because no one knows what's going to happen. Is there a serious threat to the survival of American democracy, to the sanctity of the Constitution? Does it feel that way? And does it feel that way viewed from afar? I think is just as important as whether it feels that way from close. Ellen, I'm going to ask you to answer that first.
Okay, well, at the risk of repeating myself again, I really think that the threat is the ownership of media by big tech. And when Susan talks about the need to preserve a democracy, I think that one of the pillars of that democracy has always been a free press. And it worries me, really worries me, that the guidelines for freedom of the press might disappear, and that the media ownership has become a real issue.
Well, you make a good point, because the ultimate in big tech dominators ordered his Washington Post not to make an endorsement of anyone in this presidential campaign, and he was able to. John Battle, do you have a quick answer on this? You'll need to unmute yourself, John. John, you need to unmute yourself. I think we've lost John for the moment. Barbara, I'll go to you next then. You're muted.
Can you hear me now, Matt? Sandy?
Yes, but I can't see you, but go ahead quickly, John.
Yeah, just to say, I think the deepening polarization of politics, even between two parties, and the press that's partisan to one side or the other, is also a massive concern, that there can be no crossing of the aisle or speaking to the opposing party, and as it were, there can be no common foundations at all. That is becoming problematic, that everything the opposition says must be wrong and everything the government says must be wrong, and there's no ever coming together. And I think that's a serious problem in our politics and in democratic politics. Just an anecdote, as a young politician, I was only in my early 30s, and I just got elected to Parliament, and there was one bar where there was only MPs, not staffers, not families, hangers-on. And I remember sitting down with a man called Gordon Brown, who was the Labour Chancellor. But before that, Mrs. Thatcher's Chancellor was Ken Clarke, a Conservative. And I remember sitting at a table having a beer with Gordon Brown and Ken Clarke, discussing economics with them when Ken Clarke was the Chancellor. The problem now is that was a fantastic experience and privilege. That would not now happen, and it needs to happen again.
Yeah.
Barbara.
Yeah, I do agree with, agree with everything so far. But while we're talking about the need for the Democratic Party to sit down and refocus itself. I think that we do need two strong parties that, it's a loyal opposition, not
Yeah.
a
Bitter.
zero-sum opposition. I
Absolutely.
think that there's a big
Yeah.
question for the Republicans about what is the Republican Party. And I think, Susan, you made, very good points that, just going after Trump is not sufficient. But Trump has made it all about him. And there is no really viable Republican Party, and no clear Republican ethos or ideology beyond Trump. And so I think, we don't have the Republican Party. I was raised a Republican. My family does not know what happened to me, but I was raised a Republican. And I was one of those people that for years said, I didn't change, the party did. And so I think, maybe it's time for both parties to sit down and decide, are we the party of Trump? Are we the party of MAGA? Is this our new series of principles and ethos and standard operating procedures? Are we comfortable with somebody who says, advise and consent is anachronistic? Or is there a legitimate conservative party that can act as a partner with a liberal Democratic Party? Neither one of them sloshing around in their extremes, but actually trying to work on governing. And I think that gets to the polarization
John,
issue.
no, I have to go to EJ very quickly to answer this question because Mike Scott is waiting with
I want to
questions from our
just say
listeners.
two things quickly. One is, I think the real problem is the radicalization of the Republican Party under Trump, and that in many other democracies with multi-party systems, that wing would be off to the side in a separate party like the Reform Party or the AfD or any number of right-wing parties we could name. Democratic Party has its problems, but it's got a lot of moderates in it. Alyssa Slotkin, who just got elected from Michigan, Abigail Spanberger, who has a very good shot of getting elected governor of Virginia. I could go on with a pretty long list. Annie Custer, who just retired in New Hampshire. And so I do think the radicalization of the Republican Party is a problem, even though Democrats have a lot of work to do. I wish I could say to your question, no, that you originally asked, but I am really worried. And I hate kind of saying that 8 days after an election, and it sounds like the panic that Susan, called out at the beginning. But the moves we've seen so far are very troublesome. And on the media, very quickly, I signed that protest note, as you probably know, Sandy, when the Post didn't endorse, but put aside that decision one way or the other. This election showed that the power of the traditional media that tries to sort of report news and provide a kind of account that everybody can agree on has really collapsed. And that in this election, all kinds of other outlets were more important, more sought after by the candidates. There's a real conversation we got to have about the media system, because it's not just because I am very devoted to the old media, but I think that their loss would be a big one, and it's particularly big at the local level.
Right,
in the
obviously
US,
true.
as you know.
Susan, very quickly.
I'll make it that I used to be a Republican too, and was very involved in policy circles. So yes, I have not, that's not been my intention to single out only Democrats. The Republican Party has to have that moment to do exactly what you say. But I'll tell you where the Republicans are today. They're all independents. The Eisenhower Republicans, the George H.W. Bush Republicans, the Ronald Reagan Republicans, a lot of them are all independents now. And I don't want anybody to think that there isn't a lot of talk about this behind the scenes. Okay. But Donald Trump just got enough support to claim that he has some power. So let me just say, That am I concerned or not? Well, of course, but it's back to this misplaced energy. I just want to say you can't get the infantry to go into battle if they think they're going to lose the war. Or I should say, you can't get them to go into an engagement if they don't feel like they can win the battle. In other words, we have to create some sense that, yes, democracy is going to work in this country, or it will collapse of its own weight. That's all I'm arguing for. And I think that whoever can come out and create a vital opposition to the things that are going on that we're all concerned about, unless that happens, it'll be almost impossible for the Republican Party to put itself back together.
Right, John, I'm sorry. Yeah, Mike, we have to go to you now for the questions. I'm sorry we came to you so late. You're muted, Mike. You're still muted. There you go.
We seem to have gremlins in. I don't know who's putting the gremlins in today, but we've had more than normal. It's been a bit of a trumpet time. Anyway, let's get to some of these questions. Victoria Mumford Smith, hello Victoria. I know you're from the UK. She just wants a clarification, I think, over the statement about Trump not being able to stand again. And she asks, will Donald Trump have the power to change the Constitution, which states that you can only act as a president twice? Can we have a quick answer on that?
The answer is no, unless he can get the Supreme Court to interpret a provision that is kind of airtight. So there is no way the Constitution will be amended. And that's very important. And I think one of the reasons I raise it is I think it's very important early on for people to note the plain language of the amendment and to say this is his last term. So he would have to overthrow the Constitution because there's no way it would be amended and that would get removed. There wouldn't be support for it. Wouldn't be enough support for it.
Okay, thanks. Wang, how will Trump's foreign policy likely influence USA's relationship with Russia and China, especially on the issues of Ukraine and Taiwan? Barbara?
Yeah, I think, Ukraine they're both critically important. And there's also the whole question of how Trump's foreign policy is going to affect Gaza, Israel, and the expanding war in the Middle East. So we have three. On Ukraine, interestingly, I don't know. I mean, I personally, if I were the Ukrainians, I would be extremely worried that continued U.S. assistance is going to be there. Trump made it. Trump, President-elect Trump, to be respectful, has made it very clear that he intends to end that war in 24 hours. And I think there's a great deal of concern about, what concessions he is going to table with the leverage that there is no more military assistance or other assistance coming to Ukraine. So I think that's the first big one. On China, there's going to be greater confrontation, the tariffs, and also what that will do to our domestic economy. In a better world, there would be an understanding that going to war with China is probably not the most prudent approach. It's another war we would lose, to be perfectly honest. And so are there going to be, going back to our favorite word, guardrails, are there going to be people who will moderate? How do you contain China, compete with China, but not confront China is going to be the very delicate balance. And on the Middle East, I have nothing but concern on how that one is going to come out. And all of these are going to have major implications in the US. I think the China one will have more implications because there's more of an economic trade factor to it. With Ukraine, you've got the future of NATO and therefore the future of Europe. And with the Middle East, we have a humanitarian catastrophe that I don't know how it's going to end.
Thank you. John Battle, from your point of view in the UK, we've lost you again, John. Can you unmute, John? No, you're still muted, John.
It's muted now. It's playing up. Yes, go on, question.
From the UK, can you just take that on a bit? Because this whole business of the relationship with Russia and China, there's a relationship with the US, which makes it more than a US relationship with the Russia and China.
Yeah, well, Britain's moved itself into our what was it? We are standing alone now, aside from the EU, and so the idea was to look to America, particularly for trade. And there's a real fear about the economy if there are real tariffs put on goods going to America. 60 billion worth goes to America, and if there's a trade barrier starts to be built with America, that could really damage our economy. And of course, the new government has got a big mandate to do something about really building a growth economy. So there's real serious worries about the economy. But the second issue is about NATO and whether Trump will push to withdraw from NATO. But then that does push the question back. And to be fair to the questions asked, the Europeans, NATO have relied on American protection, if you like, the umbrella of American protection, not least in our contribution to the defense factor in NATO. In other words, there are real questions to be asked within NATO itself. But if there is a withdrawal from NATO, then the whole question of Ukraine's up in the air again as well. And there are really, the approach being taken at the moment on this side and within, as far as I can understand it, and I'm not party to the inner workings of government at the moment, though I have connections, I get the impression that cautious pragmatism is the way forward. See what's proposed, deal with it in detail, patiently and courteously, and not go down, as I think one of the contributors said, the role of just rubbishing the new administration and saying to hell in a handcart with it and it's your problem. No, engage, and engage pragmatically, I think, is going to be the approach.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question's come in about the fact that democracy is being threatened through the press and the control over the press and through the issues being debated. What about the universities? Part of the democracy is the autonomy of the university. Is that being threatened now, Susan?
Well, I think it depends on which university. It depends on which college, and I think I haven't been back to my own institution since the election. I just got back from France, as a matter of fact, so I am listening to these this assessment about the international reaction with great interest. You know, I think my own institution, Gettysburg College, is working very hard to make sure that people of differing viewpoints actually interact with each other. We had a big party is the wrong word, but a big gathering of Democrat and Republican students to watch the election returns together. And so I think that's a very individualized question.
I just want to say, I do think that after all of the controversy around Gaza and lots of questions about free speech and what it means, I think you could see a concerted attack on universities, and probably the elite ones, so-called elite ones. I love Gettysburg College. You know, will be the first in line for this attack, and so I think it is very worrisome. By the way, just on John Battle's point, I think our allies have to stand up for democracy in the world as best they can, and there's no choice but to deal pragmatically with the U.S. government right now, and that's what I think you're seeing countries do. I don't see any other option, but I do hope that within the framework of that pragmatism, there remains this commitment. If we fall back, other countries will step in on behalf of democratic values.
Mike, if I may intervene for 1 second, I agree entirely with EJ about the threat to universities and to small colleges. There's a new round of book bannings being prepared and coming out in Florida once again. And the educational system is going to be a major target, not just colleges and universities, but the younger students as well.
I'm sorry, I guess I misinterpreted the question. I thought you were talking about campus protests and that kind of thing, not book burning or whatever we're going to call that. Yeah.
If I can just jump in, I've been in the academic world for 20 years now. And while there is going to be a big push on elite universities, which is somewhat ironic given the alma maters of the president and the vice president-elect, a little bit of hypocrisy. I think the schools that are going to be targeted the first and the hardest are going to be state universities. And I think we can look to what DeSantis did in Florida. There is federal money, there are federal grants, the federal government has far more sway over public universities. And if you have governors who agree, I think that they may wish to go after elites, but they're going to go after publics.
Yeah, if
That's a
if
very
you look
good
at
point.
history, you
Yeah.
do first burn the books. A tyrant burns the books, and it goes right through history. I'm going to close really in a moment, and I'm going to close with a question or a statement from Claudio Calogero. Although it's not been a landslide, I can't help noticing how many people potentially gave up their freedom because of the levitation of prices. And this is exactly what already happened in the past when few democracies turned to be dictatorships, seeking a way out of economic difficulties. When people wanted to sedate their anger, handing over their rights as they went blind by propaganda. I'm sure that he's thinking of the 1930s there. Yes. Yeah. Any comment on that as a last comment before we close?
I
EJ?
think there were plenty of people who voted for Trump who did not vote for that. But that I think it's a very shrewd comment because people vote in protest. They're angry about particular things. They didn't believe that Trump would either do this or have the power to do this. Our job is to prevent him from doing the worst. It will not be the first time that people got far more than they bargained for when they cast a vote, unfortunately.
Barbara, do you want to say anything? You muted, Barbara.
Yeah, I know. First of all, it's a great statement. So thank the participant for sharing that. I think a lot of Trump voters, a lot of people who voted for Trump, it was anger, it was frustration, it was prices, and many of them chose to take his more extreme statements as rhetoric and not action verbs. And I think when they see the effect of the tariffs, if they go into effect, or some of the other, they see if the deportations are as extensive as he wants, I think that there will be a lot of reaction to that. And ironically, the economy is balancing out in ways that will sort of moot some of that anger, hopefully. And then to go back to an earlier comment, we have midterm elections.
Susan?
No, I would just say that it's going to be a highly dynamic situation. Let's hope that we can keep our heads about us, because that is the clearest way to develop a good sustainable strategy for building our institutions. I'm not prepared to let one person's role in our government, I don't care whether it's a president of the United States or anything, discourage me from working hard to bring along my students and make them better, more aware citizens. And I hope that the news media will just begin to frame things in a doable fashion, because everybody is extremely stressed out at the moment in our country, and this does not tend to attract support over time.
Well
Can I-
said.
Can I just say, in England, what we said at the
We
general
have
election,
2.5 minutes before we must conclude, John.
just to say, look forward and not backwards. Let's not rewrite history, and you misuse the word sometimes fascist and the rest of it, because it tends to turn backwards. I think we have to rebuild the future and get the next generation thinking of how they will rebuild our democratic institutions in a positive, bright and forward-looking way. And we see that as our challenge here on the left in Britain.
Thanks for that. Thanks to John Battle, Helen Closh-Stevens, Susan Eisenhower, E.J. Dionne, and Barbara Bodine for a fantastic discussion. Thanks also to you, Sandy, for your input to the discussion and your conduct of the first part of the program. Can I say the next free speech project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event in association with the Future Humanities Project will be on Wednesday, December the 4th, when we will be discussing living with China. What does China want? We are getting on with the issues that are in the press now and in our consciousness now. The next Cultural Encounters book that we have, a book of books that have made a difference, will be on Monday the 18th, when Professor Neil Garrard will be discussing A Month in the Country. That is at 4 o'clock as well as today, and as well as on Wednesday, December the 4th. For today, our thanks to colleagues at Georgetown, President Jack DeJoy, Vice President Tom Banchoff, Blackfriars to John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, Director to Las Casas, Campion Hall to Dr. Nick Austin, SJ. My thanks to John McCabe and colleagues at Georgetown who made this Zoom happen, and also to Maggie, my wife, who helps them from this side. I'd like to thank all of those of you who've asked questions, those of you who've attended today, as would Sandy. Thank you all for being with us and for your support for our various series. I'm Professor Michael Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until next time, take care and keep safe. Bye-bye, everybody, and thank you.